Okay, here's this lecture's list of heroes and geniuses. We'll finish the career of Jan van Eyck today and see the Ghent altarpiece, one of the supreme achievements of Northern Renaissance painting. Robert Campin is often talked about before Van Eyck in classes like this because I guess his work just doesn't look as sophisticated as Van Eyck's. It looks like the work of an earlier painter, but they're essentially contemporary. In any case, we'll hear about Campin today. Nicolas Rolin was Philip the Good's chancellor and was at least as important a patron of the arts as Philip himself. We've already met Charles VII and seen his portrait by Jean Fouquet, the most important French painter of the 15th century, and we'll hear more about both of them today. We'll also visit the Palais Jacques Coeur, the home of one of the great adventurers of the age, and we'll hear about Charles the Bold, Philip the Good's son, and see his portrait by Roger van der Weyden, who was the successor to Van Eyck as holder of the title Greatest Painter in Flanders. So that's the cast, and now for the show. So last time I was talking about Philip the Good and Van Eyck, and this is one of Van Eyck's most important pictures. Philip's chancellor, Nicolas Rolin with a Virgin. Rolin became Philip's advisor soon after the latter moved to Flanders following the assassination of his father, John the Fearless, and Rolin served Philip in that office for 37 years until he was in his mid-80s. He was the Richelieu, the Henry Kissinger of his day. This is a picture which has often been regarded as a bit presumptuous, in fact. It was rare, if not unprecedented, for a donor to have himself painted having a private audience with the Virgin, without any saints or any other chaperones in attendance. But that Rolin would have had himself so painted is certainly consistent with what we know about his character. His most important achievement as a diplomat came in 1435, when he worked out the Treaty of Arras that brought Burgundy back onto the French side in the 100 Years' War. You'll remember that Philip, his boss, had sided with the English following the assassination of his father in the presence of the then Dauphin, now King Charles VII in 1419. This bridge in the picture has been interpreted in various ways. It may be meant to serve just as a sort of symbolic link between Rolin and the Virgin, from the secular to the sacred in some way, but it's often suggested that it may also make reference to this Treaty of Arras. One of the most important points of the treaty required Charles VII to say he was sorry for the death of Philip's father and to order a monument erected on the bridge at Montereau, south of Paris, where the assassination had taken place in the Dauphin's presence. The landscape here does not look at all like Montereau, but the prominence given the bridge, which does seem to have a monument on it, is still suggestive. The exact date of the picture isn't certain either. If it was in fact painted before 1435, it's unlikely there would be any reference to Montereau in it. A lot of scholars have tried to figure out what cities appear in Van Eyck's paintings. They look so real it's hard to believe they're imaginary, but the truth is that that's just what they seem to be. No one's been able to convincingly argue that he's painting actual cities as he saw them, as it were, on location. You can see a man in a red turban here, and as I've said before, such a figure is often thought to be, if not actually a self-portrait, then a kind of Van Eyck signature. Here's Rolin up more closely now. He was about 60 if this was painted in 1435, and is clearly wearing a toupee, I think. He was from Autun, and while, as I said, the background landscape doesn't seem to be an accurate rendering of any place, it looks like there are vineyards to the left of the river, which do bring French Burgundy, where Rolin grew up, to mind. We know he was in the wine business and other businesses as well. We also know that he was bribed by the French to get the Treaty of Arras expedited. One of his contemporaries, Jacques Duclair, evaluated his character by saying simply that no man was more politically and materially successful, but Duclair says, as to his spiritual condition, I'll say nothing. As Gerhard Grote, the founder of the Brethren of the Common Life I mentioned last time, says, labor is holy, but business is dangerous. When he died at 86, no one wanted to tell Philip, who had relied on him for so long, and finally John Chevreul, the Bishop of Tournai, took it upon himself to break the news, but even he did so reluctantly. He started off by telling Philip that Roland wasn't coming into the office, as it were, today, and Philip said, well, that's understandable. When you're 86, it's sometimes hard to get up in the morning. And then Chevreul had to say, well, I don't think he'll be coming in today at all, Your Majesty. And that made Philip suspicious. Finally, Chevreul had to tell him the truth. He wasn't coming in anymore at all. Here's the Madonna. So Roland probably didn't really deserve a private audience with the Virgin based on what we know of his earthly life. George Chastelain, Philip's official historian, says, all affairs of state were in his hands and he lived as though he would live forever. It's tempting to regard Van Eyck's paintings as photo-like, but that's only true of the details like this, really. The eye and the camera lens do not see the whole world as equally in focus the way Van Eyck painted it. The recognition of this by painters like Velázquez and Rembrandt in the 17th century is going to be one of the great breakthroughs that makes their work so amazing to us, and we'll hear more about this all next quarter. As I mentioned last time, when art historians make the distinction between conception and execution, Van Eyck is always considered among the foremost painters in the latter class. You're seeing the crown of the Queen of Heaven here being presented to the Virgin. No one has surpassed his ability as a technician at executing his ideas. The great Italians of his day, like Masaccio and Fra Angelico, are more often put in the category of those whose work conception is emphasized rather than detailed execution. I wouldn't put too much weight on this distinction, though. I think Masaccio, no less than Van Eyck, executed his work exactly the way he wanted to, and conversely, it's not easy to argue that the conceptions of Van Eyck are inferior. The craft, the ability of the painter, I think, is something that's more evident, though, in the work of the Flemish masters. And in the 15th century, the word ars, the Latin word ars, A-R-S, meant manual skill. And as I say, that's something that's really evident in the work of these people to a virtually miraculous degree. This is where Nicholas Roland was born, in Burgundy, into an obviously already prosperous family, which he made even more and more prosperous. It's now the Roland Museum, and we saw some things in it in the class on the Middle Ages a few months ago. It's right across the street from the fine Cathedral of Saint-Lazare d'Autun, famous for the work of the 12th century sculptor Gisèle Berthès, among other things. And it was in this cathedral that Roland was eventually to be buried, and the picture we just saw was displayed in the family chapel there for centuries. Much of Roland's later diplomatic work was focused on the attempt to get Tanguy de Chastel, the bodyguard of Charles VII and the actual assassin of Philip's father, punished, but little came of this. Roland himself, as Philip's chancellor, had 24 bodyguards of his own. After the Treaty of Arras was signed, the Burgundian court spent more time back in French Burgundy, especially in Dijon, the old capital. In 1443, Roland donated the money to build a famous charity hospital known as the Hôtel Dieu in Beaune, not far from Dijon. This was a working hospital until 1971, and the kitchen was in use supplying the new modern wing, which is essentially a rest home now, for several years more. Roland's Hôtel Dieu is always considered one of the finest urban secular buildings of the 15th century in all Europe. Its only real rival in France that comes to mind is the Palais Jacques Coeur in Bourges, which we'll see later. Here you are inside now. The Salle des Pauvres, the main infirmary, has an arrangement set up here such as to place the invalids literally in the bosom of the church. The beds were aligned so that the occupants could see the altar, which was occupied by the gigantic Roger van der Weyden Last Judgment, which is now in the museum attached to the building and which we'll eventually see too. Although the patients would have gotten the best medical care available, the emphasis was on their spiritual care. They were being cared for in an atmosphere such that those at least who had strong faith, I think, could feel confident that the Lord and the saints were in charge and all would come to pass according to their will. Here you can get a closer look at the way the beds are arranged. Everyone has a private cubicle, if not a private room. The setup of the place has probably hardly changed in 500 years. I've seen 19th century photos with people occupying the beds here, and it all looks just as it does today. Modern hospitals, of course, try to do this kind of thing a bit, that is, try to create a more comfortable, user-friendly atmosphere, decorate maternity wards to look like Beatrix Potter's bedroom and so on. But the emphasis in most modern hospitals is, of course, and this is hardly something to complain about, almost totally on the technology of body repair. And while it's hard as I say to complain about this, the atmosphere that goes with it can be pretty frightening. Here's the kitchen which I mentioned earlier, and which looks like it could be fired up again at any time if necessary. As I said, it was still being used to prepare food for the modern hospital until, I'd say 1980 or so. As I mentioned earlier, Roland was a vineyard owner and wine merchant, and his property was in the heart of what has been since antiquity one of the greatest wine-producing areas in the world. Petrarch claimed the Pope stayed, as a matter of fact, so long in Avignon because of the French wine. The Wine Museum of Beaune, you see here, is in a building which occasionally served as a residence for the Dukes of Burgundy on stays here in the 15th century. It pays tribute to the history of wine in Burgundy. You get another view of it here now. To finance the operation of the hospital, as a matter of fact, Roland gave over to it some of his best vineyards, and every year on November 3rd, still, the auction of the grapes grown on property that benefits the hospital takes place, and it's one of the premier events in the Burgundian wine world. This is the Chateau of Rochepot now, just a few miles south of Beaune, where Roland's friend Philippe Pot lived, spelled P-O-T. Roland named his daughter Philippe Pot after him, just making a feminine pronoun out of the fellow's whole name, and her daughter, Roland's granddaughter, Anne, was the mother of Anne de Montmorency, the famous 16th century French general we'll hear about next quarter. It's not as big a chateau as the famous Loire Valley chateaus. It's a sort of starter castle, I guess. It has been extensively restored, but it still has a lot of atmosphere and charm. The chateau later belonged to the family of Lazare Carnot, who was on the Committee of Public Safety during the Revolution. We'll hear about all that in a few months. His son was a famous physicist, and his grandson was president of France. The Carnot family still owns it, and although it's not their usual residence, they do use it. There's a famous legend involving Philippe Pot in one version and his father Regnier. The version involving Regnier is perhaps the more likely to have some truth in it. It goes that he was captured by the Turks at Nicopolis, along with Philip the Good's father and the Marechal de Boucicaut, you'll remember. And for some reason, Regnier Pot was asked to marry the Sultan's sister. Since he already had a wife, he refused to do this. So he was thrown into a pit with a lion. In one version, he stuck his fist down the lion's throat and choked it. In another, he cut off its paws, having been advised by the Virgin in a vision to hit below the belt, which doesn't seem like advice the Virgin would be likely to give. But in any case, the Sultan was impressed and let him go. Here you see the gardens now. This is supposed to be the origin of the family motto, Tant il vaut, that is, à beauté tant il vaut, to beauty what it deserves, but skeptics think the story was concocted to try to explain the motto which actually predated it. You're hearing an instrumental version of Guillaume Dufay's famous chanson, C'est la face pâle, If My Face Be Pale. A work of music that was to be reworked in many versions. There's a mass based on it. Here's another view of the courtyard at Rochepole. And another. Here's the tower from which one could survey most of Burgundy. Inside now, this is the Salle de Garde. There aren't any real masterpieces here. Lots of antiques and collectibles that have belonged to the family, in some cases for centuries. And the dining room now, which is still used on occasion, as is the kitchen here. Philippe Pau was buried in a splendid tomb at the Abbey of Citeaux in Burgundy, and the gisons and pleurants from this are now in the Louvre. We don't know who made this, but it should remind you of the tombs in the Ducal Palace made by Klaus Schluter and his successors there, that is the Ducal Palace in Dijon. The pleurants here, the weepers though, are life-size. This is the Cathedral of Ghent now, typical of the Flemish Gothic style, like Notre Dame in Bruges, which we saw last time, with its single facade tower, but no one comes to Ghent to see this church. They come to see its altarpiece by Van Eyck. The Ghent altarpiece, the altarpiece of the Lamb. You're hearing the Agnus Dei, Behold the Lamb of God, as a matter of fact, from Dufay's Mass, C'est la face pâle again. We've digressed a little from Van Eyck's career, but we'll wind up now with his work, the work which, well, Thomas Hoving, for what his opinion is worth, calls arguably the most triumphant masterpiece of Western civilization. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe called it the keystone in the history of art. Here you see from the front of the altarpiece, and we'll see the whole thing and much more of it in detail in a bit too. Here you see Jodocus Vith. His name's spelled at least 4 or 5 different ways by various authorities. The man who commissioned the Ghent altarpiece, and this picture of him as a donor is, as I say, on the front in one of the exterior panels. Like Andrea Scrovegni, the famous patron of Giotto's Arena Chapel, Vith had a father of dubious character. He was also, like Scrovegni, childless. And to try to sort of rehabilitate the family name and to leave something behind in lieu of children, he commissioned this for the Cathedral of Ghent. This was, in fact, such a public relations success that he was then elected mayor. It's hard to imagine any candidate today trying to get votes by claiming responsibility for a great work of art. Well, this is the way the Ghent altarpiece would have looked closed, as it would have been on ordinary days. Jodocus Vith and his wife are at the bottom on either side of John the Baptist and John the Evangelist, who are rendered here in grisaille. Grisaille is monochrome work mimicking sculpture. Above is the Annunciation, and above that 2 prophets, Micah and Zechariah, and 2 pagan Sibyls. The Sibyls, as many of you will remember, also are said to have known of the coming of the Savior in the reign of Augustus, so they're very common in Christian art. Until about 10 years ago, the altarpiece was displayed in a cramped little chapel that would only hold a few tourists at a time. And a guy had to stand by it and open it and shut it every few minutes. Now it's right inside the entrance to the church. so you can walk all the way around it and see it front or back as you please. At the discretion of the bishop, then, the altarpiece would have been opened like this. On all important feast days and some Sundays. There's a copy of what is thought by many to have been an original inscription on the frame, which says, in effect, that Hubert van Eyck, the greatest artist of the day, began this altarpiece and Jan finished it. It's hard to know what we're to make of this. Essentially, on the strength of this text, which is itself 16th century, all sorts of things have been attributed, none very convincingly, to this fellow called Hubert van Eyck. There was, in fact, apparently such a person who died in 1426. Since the Ghent altarpiece was apparently finished in 1432, however, it seems unlikely he could have had much to do with it, and no scholar has been able to convincingly demonstrate that two painters were responsible for it anyway. Conceivably, Hubert was Jan's older brother, and the commission was given to him as early as 1426, and then the altarpiece was actually painted after his death by Jan. This is a complex issue, and Peter Murray says that more has been written about it than any other puzzle in the history of art. The work is often called the Adoration of the Lamb, or some version of that, because of the character of the lower panel in the center. Here, Old Testament, New Testament, and post-biblical heroes approach a kind of altar on which is depicted a bleeding lamb. We'll see this panel up closer in a few minutes. Below that is a fountain. The primary source for this motif is perhaps the Revelation of St. John, in which the river of the water of life is shown flowing from the throne of the Lamb of God. But the account of All Saints' Day in the Golden Legend also suggests the arrangement of figures here. From the left of this panel, the so-called Just Judges and Christian Knights approach. From the right come hermits and pilgrims with St. Christopher prominent in the foreground. Above we have Adam and Eve, and on either side, groups of angel musicians, with the group known as the Isis or Lesser Trinity there in the center, Mary, Jesus, and John the Baptist. Adam and Eve are given considerable prominence. They are not life-size, but they are certainly the largest nudes to have been painted since the fall of Rome. Adam is a far cry from the idealized males of the Italian Renaissance, although most of those are, it's true, later in the 15th century, 16th century. He just looks sort of like a farmer who's been made to take his clothes off. It's been pointed out, in fact, that his hands and face are slightly sunburned. Eve is more idealized, I guess, although the pear-shaped figure that always makes 15th century women look pregnant is not in fashion today, of course. She holds what looks like a kind of lemon instead of the apple we associate with the Garden of Eden. But the Bible doesn't specify the fruit. One theory has it, and I think this is the likely explanation. One theory has it that the apple came to be identified with the forbidden fruit because the Latin word for evil and the Latin word for apple tree are homographs. They're spelled the same way, M-A-L-U-S. But of course they were spelled the same way in the 15th century too, and the lemon was used, as I say. In this altarpiece, Adam and Eve apparently just represent humanity at large, which stands to benefit from the efforts of the more holy subjects in the altarpiece. They do seem a little bit out of place, though, both as subjects in a way and by their size. Here you can see the panels with the so-called Just Judges and Christian Knights. They're to the left of the actual Adoration of the Lamb panel. They're called the Just Judges and the Christian Knights just arbitrarily, but those seem like fair designations. In 1934, the Just Judges panel was stolen along with the John the Baptist on the back of it by a fellow named Arsène Goudurtier. So what you see there is now a copy. The John the Baptist was recovered from a railroad storage locker, but the Just Judges panel has never been found, even though when Goudurtier died, he left a letter saying it was somewhere in Brussels and couldn't be recovered without attracting attention. Of course, not one tourist in 1,000 notices that this is a copy, or thinks this isn't as fine a work of art as what you see in the rest of the altarpiece. Those who argue that the appearance of a work of art is what makes it valuable obviously have to do a lot of talking to deal with this kind of thing. The copy was based on photos and on an earlier copy in Antwerp by Michael Coxey. The Just Judges panel contains figures identified in various ways. It seems likely to me that the bottom figure is Philip the Bold, and then above him would be his son John the Fearless, Jean Sans Peur, and turning toward him and above him would be his son Philip the Good. The Christian knights are also variously identified. At the back, the crowned figure may be Charles VII, but he doesn't look much like the fellow in Fouquet's portrait we saw last time. Here you can see the adoration panel up more closely. That's the central lower panel, remember, when the altarpiece is open. At the left are figures representing the Old Testament, including one that may represent Virgil, who, like the Sibyls, was looked upon as almost in the same class as the Hebrew prophets. His Messiah Eclogue, number 4 I think it was, seemed to foretell the coming of the Savior in the manner of the Sibylline prophecies. He was probably talking about the hoped-for son of Augustus, but Christians have seized on this. He's thought to be the fellow Virgil now, in white, wearing the laurel crown. He holds a sprig of holly, which was regarded by the Romans as a sort of sacred plant. The fellow in front of him is wearing a red turban, which does at least bring Van Eyck to mind, and like Virgil, he holds a plant, which does look as though it came off a variety of oak tree. What's interesting here is that in Dutch, oak is Eyck. Does that further the case that this is Van Eyck? Red turban, Eyck leaf? Not decisive, but, as I say, suggestive. To the right are the apostles and saints, with Peter and Paul identifiable at the top of the group by their usual iconographic features. There are popes and saints to the right of them, many of them also carrying their attributes. Above, the Old Testament figures are said to be holy bishops and confessors, and to the upper right are female saints and martyrs. Again, arranged, although the ultimate inspiration for this whole program may be the revelation of St. John, they're arranged very much the way Jacques de Voragine describes a kind of ideal celebration of All Saints' Day. Well, we're going to see some more of the altarpiece in more detail now, and hear more of Guillaume Dufay's Mass, the Missa Syllophasie Pal, based on that song. Well, I wouldn't want to be the artist to have to follow Van Eyck on this stage here, but Robert Campin is certainly an important artist in his own right. He's also known as the Master of Flamel, and he was essentially a contemporary of Van Eyck's, outlived him as a matter of fact by a few years anyway, but he's usually regarded as his predecessor. The Marode altarpiece, which you see here, is one of the few works thought certainly by him in the cloisters in New York. It's called the Marode altarpiece after the name of a family that once owned it, and Campin is called the Master of Flamel because one of his paintings is thought to have come from a monastery there. Here it is up closer now. You're hearing Dufay's setting of Petrarch's poem Virgine Bella, set to music by several important composers in the 14th, 15th centuries. Unlike Van Eyck, Robert Campin never worked for a noble patron. He was a middle-class artist who probably spent most of his life in Tournai and worked there for the middle class. The fellow who commissioned this was named Engelbrecht, and he's one of the first bourgeois donors to appear in a Flemish work of art. Unlike the brazen Rollin, he just peeks through the door at the Virgin, who, it's true, is otherwise engaged. Presumably even Rollin wouldn't have barged in during the Annunciation, though. If the usual date given for this, 1428 or so, is right, it's a bit surprising that the geometry of the room is so confused. Brunelleschi down in Florence had mastered one-point perspective by about 1425, and the use of it spread rapidly. It's certainly something you can see made use of by Van Eyck in the Ghent altarpiece, although I didn't point that out when we were looking at it. In Italy, the Virgin almost never wears red. Blue is the color associated with faith. In the north, however, blue came to be associated not so much with faith as with gullibility, with misplaced faith. This is something we'll see made use of by Bosch eventually. Sometimes the Virgin does wear blue in the north, but often she wears both blue and red, or all red in this case, and in the Madonna with Chancellor Rollin we saw a few minutes ago as well. As is often the case in Renaissance painting, what she wears is not, as it were, a real dress, but rather something to make her look more monumental. She's clearly too big to sit on that bench behind her, but what she's actually sitting on isn't clear. There are all sorts of other symbolic things in the picture which we just don't have time to go into. Joseph is at the right. You probably all know that he was a carpenter, but medieval tradition supplied a specialty for him. He made mouse traps, as he's doing here. The mouse trap, in one of the more exotic flings of medieval imagination, was thought to be a fit symbol for the cross on which Jesus was placed as the bait to catch the devil, aka the rat. This nativity is another picture attributed to Robert Campin. It's in the Dijon Musée des Beaux-Arts, like quite a few things we've already seen. According to the Golden Legend, the Virgin was attended at the Nativity by two midwives, Salome and Zabel. Salome didn't believe Jesus to be the real Savior, and for this her hand was made to wither. She's at the right in blue here. She touched the baby, however, and her hand was made whole again, which convinced her. She's holding her hand forward to draw attention to this. For whatever reason, the Nativity with the shepherds in the Gospel of Luke was more popular than the Epiphany with the Magi or the kings from Matthew in the north. There's a beautiful landscape in the background you see here. Robert Campin may have had trouble with geometrical perspective, but he clearly knew all about atmospheric perspective. H.W. Jansen it is, I believe, who says that Van Eyck invented atmospheric perspective. That would in any case be an oversimplification, but this picture was probably painted about 1430, before at least most of Van Eyck's work was done. Although it's not very large, it's true. I'd say that it's ahead of any landscape contemporary with it in Italy, and equal to or ahead of any by Van Eyck. The fine dawn light also suggests Leonardo's claim of 50 years later that it's the best light to use in a painting. You're hearing a song now by Guillaume Dufay called Par le regard de vos beaux yeux. Petrus Christus is the only important painter it is generally thought was a pupil of Jan van Eyck's, although he can only be documented in Bruges after Van Eyck's death. This portrait in Berlin is attributed to him, to Petrus Christus, and it's always been interesting to me, in part because of its resemblance to the famous bust of Nefertiti, also in Berlin, and which you can probably call to mind. The shape of the face, the almond eyes, the high headdress, the broad collar, all are very similar. I wouldn't draw any quick conclusions from this, but it is a relevant thing to bring up if you have occasion to discuss the changing standards of feminine beauty over the ages. Something a little different now. We'll return to France to wind up the 100 Years' War, which has, as it were, been going on behind the scenes during the careers of Van Eyck and Robert Campin. This is a modern statue of the French constable Arthur de Richemont, the son of Jean de Montfort, whom the English had supported in his efforts to hold Brittany. Richemont's complex career spanned the whole second half of the war. He fought at Agincourt on the French side and was with Joan and other heroes at Orléans. In 1435, he was involved with Roland in negotiating the Turning Point Treaty of Arras, and in 1436 he was instrumental in forcing the English to evacuate Paris. In 1450, he was one of the French commanders at Formigny, where cannons were used on a large scale for one of the first times, and bested the heavily outnumbered English longbowmen. Another of the French heroes in the second half of the war was Jean d'Aulnoy, who I mentioned earlier in connection with Joan. He was the illegitimate son of Louis d'Orléans. His half-brother Charles d'Orléans gave him this chateau, Chateau d'Un in the Loire Valley, more or less to use during the latter's 25-year house arrest in England after he was captured at Agincourt by the English. d'Aulnoy was with Richemont at the time of the reoccupation of Paris by the French and also played a role in the campaign leading up to the Battle of Formigny. One of the things that makes the 15th century chateaus so interesting to us, I think, is the fact that they're sort of at a crossroad between the old fortresses, the old chateau forts of the Middle Ages, and the great domestic architecture, really, of the 16th century to come. They're still part fortress, but part house at the same time. Here you can see the courtyard. In 1453, then, the English commander Talbot was killed at Castillon near Bordeaux, and the English gave up everything in France but Calais. Here you can see another manuscript illustration on a page in a book, again from the pen and brush of Jean Fouquet. You see Paris here with the English devils flying off with their tails between their legs. Although the English signed a treaty after Castillon that meant the de facto loss of the war, the English didn't really admit this for 3 centuries. Every king of England was, on English paper anyway, also the king of France and was crowned as such in Westminster Abbey. Only in Napoleon's day did the English give up the claim to be ruling France in the Treaty of Amiens in 1802. This is supposed to represent Jerusalem, but Fouquet had never been to Palestine. Here you can see a self-portrait, presumed self-portrait of Jean Fouquet, who was the greatest illuminator and panel painter in France in the 15th century. We've already seen his portrait of Charles VII, and he also painted a portrait of Pope Eugenius IV while he was on a trip to Italy. This is a likely self-portrait, a small, strange work, enamel on metal. Well, here you can see Charles VII enthroned. Again, this page is the work of Jean Fouquet from another book. Enthroned is Charles and presiding over the trial of the Duc d'Alençon, who was one of those who conspired with Charles's own son, the future Louis XI, against him. As I mentioned last time, not only was Charles disowned by his parents, he was in effect disowned by his son as well. The fact that he was King of France in more than title by 1440 didn't mean that all of his problems were over. Alençon was eventually executed, and Louis the Dauphin, his son, Charles's son, was banished to the Dauphiné and then eventually fled to Flanders, as we'll see later. The rebellion of Louis and Alençon was in part a manifestation of noble distaste for the many non-noble people on whom Charles relied for advice and whom he gave important positions. And we'll hear about those, see some other fine works of French 15th century art, perhaps the finest example of urban secular French architecture, all just a bit then after the break which we'll take now.